Hi everyone, my name is Christoph Döpmann and I would like to present to you today our work called Modeling Tor Network Growth by Extrapolating Consensus Data. To get us all on board, let me first very briefly introduce the Tor network itself. So Tor is the largest deployed anonymization network. It consists of several thousand so-called relays that are used by clients to tunnel their traffic through the network. Anonymity is achieved by the fact that only the immediate predecessor and successor of a relay know each other. What is relevant for us is that at every point in time, the state of the network, for example, which relays are online and some of their properties, such as their bandwidth, are collected and distributed in form of so-called consensus documents. So this talk is about growth of Tor because as we can see, Tor has grown quite significantly in the past, and it is expected to continue that growth even further. This is not only driven by the society's increased need for online privacy, but also by technical advances. For example, there are ongoing efforts to directly embed Tor into more software, broadening its user base. Therefore, research on Tor growth is very relevant, but also quite difficult because while there are a lot of existing tools and methods for Tor research, those cannot easily be applied to scaled versions of the Tor network. And we want to make this use case and research direction more accessible. And for that, we first need to model Tor growth. When doing so, what we need to ask ourselves first, of course, is how does Tor actually grow? So Tor consists of resources that are donated by volunteers. And for this work now, we make use of a notion known from other distributed systems by differentiating growth into vertical growth on the one hand and horizontal growth on the other hand. By vertical, we here mean that there's more bandwidth added to the single existing relays, and horizontal means for us that there are just more relays added to the network. And we first wanted to see whether this distinction is actually also valid in the context of Tor. For that, we took a look at the history of Tor, and you can see here the average bandwidth per relay over time and the number of relays. So from first sight, we can see that actually both dimensions have been relevant in the past, but it's quite hard to see much more than that in this particular plot. So what we did is we processed this data further and came to this result. So what you can see here is for every point in time, we compared the network half a year ago, before that time, and half a year after. And from those 2 points in time, we computed a change rate for both horizontal and vertical growth, giving us some kind of moving annual growth rate, if you want. We smoothened that curve, and from that we can see that indeed both dimensions of growth have been very relevant in the past. They have actually taken turns over time. So there have been phases in which there was both vertical and horizontal growth, and other phases in which, for example, there was only vertical growth. So with this clarified, let's look at the core contribution of our work. So what we're doing is we're extrapolating existing consensus data in order to enable research on TOR growth. So in particular, what we're putting forward here is our implementation TOR synth that implements the growth model we have put forward here. And TOR synth takes as input consensus data, so network snapshots more or less, but also outputs consensus documents. And this enables the integration into existing research tools and methods, because tools like TOR-PS, Shadow, and TOR-Net tools do actually use consensus documents. And therefore, we can, with our contribution, apply all of these tools also in the context of a growing TOR network. So let's have a look at how we model growth. First of all, let's look at the case of vertical growth. This is relatively easy because relays only grow by bandwidth in this case. So we can just apply some rate factor to the bandwidth of each relay. But of course, these factors do not have to be uniform for the whole network. So we implemented 2 different distributions here. One that applies the growth factor per bandwidth quantile, and one that does so by relay class. So for example, if guards and exits are to grow in different terms. In order to realize that, we actually do need to solve an equation system that realizes those growth rates. But for the hard details, I would like to refer you to our paper. Let's have a look at the maybe more interesting part in the matter of horizontal growth, because here we need to create and somewhat invent new relays. Those relays, though, still need to be representative of the input consensus. And in order to achieve this, what we did is we sample existing base relays, clone them, and modify them. And by doing so, we inherently replicate existing properties within the network, such as bandwidth, autonomous systems, relay family, country, etc. And we don't have to capture those distributions and relationships by hand. Okay, so After that, we wanted to see whether our model is actually useful, and we carried out a validation by doing the following. Again, we made use of the historic development of Tor. We selected 2 time periods, and from these, looking at the real world data, we computed the amount of growth that occurred. We fed these factors into our TorSynth tool and compared the resulting network states. Here you can see CDF plots of the consensus weights that are present in the network. And as you can see, TorSynth does actually approximate the real growth quite closely. So the resulting curves are rather similar. However, we can also see the limitations of our approach. Because if you have a look at the right-hand side, if the time span grows too large, the generated network starts to differ from reality. This is somewhat in line with our expectations, because our approach keeps the network properties of the input data, and it cannot and isn't meant to foresee any structural changes that happen to the real network over time. Based on our model, we now wanted to see whether we can draw any knowledge from that about the real Tor network. So what we did is we carried out a case study to see how performance is impacted by scaling Tor. We carried out large-scale simulations of the Tor network, whereas it was scaled horizontally or vertically. And by looking at the results, we can see that there's a surprisingly large difference between those 2 approaches, those 2 growth dimensions actually. So while for circuit build time there isn't too much of a difference, the difference becomes quite clear when looking at transfer times, in this case of 5 megabit files. Here we can see that horizontally grown network performs significantly worse than the Tor network that had only vertical growth. We suspect that this could be due to a resource allocation phenomenon in the Tor network, but further research would have to find the exact reasons. Okay, with that, let me conclude. In this work, we presented TorSynth, our approach to scaling Tor consensuses. Using TorSynth allows researchers to apply their existing tools and methods also to scaled Tor networks. And we showed that TorSynth is effective at maintaining the existing network properties and transferring them to scaled Tor networks. Using our methodology, we showed that purely horizontal growth can actually be suboptimal for performance in Tor compared to vertical growth. With that, thank you very much for your attention.